good morning or afternoon, where this webinar may find you. Thank you for joining us today for yet another extremely informative, we hope, webinar brought to you by the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. We have very distinguished guests as always, but before I make their introductions, let me just give you a couple of administrative information that you may be finding helpful. The webinar format is a presentation followed by a roundtable discussion among the distinguished professors. However, we welcome your questions, preferably in the Q&A box that you can find normally at the bottom of your Zoom application. And we will wait until the end of the presentation and when we start the roundtable to address those questions. And of course, bear in mind that in the interest of time, we may not be able to address them all. So today's presentation by Professor Prieger refers to his most recent research on taxation of reduced harm nicotine-containing products. And allow me please to introduce not only the presenter at this time, but also the two distinguished panelists. And some of you who've been with us at other webinars have had the pleasure to meet them. But for those of you who haven't, I will make brief introductions of all three and then yield the floor to Professor Prieger. Professor James Prieger is an economist specializing in regulatory economics, industrial organization, and applied econometrics at Pepperdine University. He has a long and distinguished career as assistant professor at the University of California at Davis and has written extensively on a diverse array of policy topics, such as the impact of telecommunications regulations on innovation, broadband deployment, digital divide, the 2009 stimulus bill, and many other topics. But recently, in his research, he's including an investigation of tobacco taxation, black market cigarettes, and other unintended consequences of regulation of tobacco products. In another current set of papers, Professor Prieger examines competitions and outcomes in the California market for broadband internet access. So as you see, very, very different, but very impactful and important topics. One of our distinguished panelists that will follow Professor Prieger's presentation is Professor Donald Kenkel from Cornell University. He has a wealth of expertise in the area of health economics and public sector economics, has conducted numerous studies on the economics of public health policies, including alcohol taxes and other policies to prevent alcohol problems, as well as cigarette taxes to prevent youth smoking, as well as advertising to promote smoking cessation. He is also a former president of the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis. The other distinguished panelist that we have the pleasure to host today is Professor Alan Mathios, a professor in the Department of Economics at Cornell University. In addition to having served as Dean of Cornell University's College of Human Ecology, he also served as a commissioner for the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. Most importantly, and perhaps even most relevantly for market dynamics, he came to Cornell following 6 years of employment at the Federal Trade Commission, where he served as a staff economist and was recognized with the Outstanding Scholarship Award, the Excellence in Economics Award, and the Award for Superior Service to the Federal Trade Commission. So, Professor Prieger, we're really, really excited to hear everything about your most recent research. Also, one last note, all the opinions presented by the presenter, the roundtable discussants, and also, of course, the questions from the audience are personal opinions. They do not reflect the position of the foundation. They're not intended to influence any decision makers. They're really just objective scientific research. So without further ado, Professor Prieger, thank you.
Thank you. So while I'm sharing my slides here, let me just mention that this is work funded by the Reason Foundation here in the US. This was not funded actually by Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, although of course they are supportive of my research with some other projects, but not this one. And of course, I do speak only for myself, not my university or any other organization here. And let me just mention up front, to clarify some of the language, since I'm talking about optimal taxation, of course, that implies a value judgment. But I do want to emphasize, I'm not, when I use words like should or would be best, I'm going to be referring to mathematical results that follow from particular mathematical objective functions, not just personal opinions or something like that. So hopefully this will be clear as we go along. And I will be speaking for about half an hour, and then we'll jump into the roundtable and your questions. Okay, so we are in a period in the last decade or so where, in addition to the cigarette taxes, which are in place in most places in the world, some jurisdictions have started to tax e-cigarettes or ENDS as well. So I will, for the sake of keeping things short on slides, I will use the acronym ENDS, Electronic Nicotine Delivery Systems, a familiar acronym for most of you probably, for e-cigarettes. So the issue, at least here in the US, is that the base for cigarette taxes is shrinking greatly. So for example, US federal revenue, tax revenue for cigarettes alone reached its peak in 2010 and is well down from that currently. At the state level, the revenue raised has not decreased overall, but only because the rates keep ratcheting up. So you can see in the graph there, the orange line is the average tax rate on the right scale. And then on the left scale, you can see that continually raising the rate was what allowed them to just barely tread water in terms of tax revenue. And so, of course, many policymakers are seeking to expand the tax base to tax ENDS as well as cigarettes. And in some jurisdictions, I'll show you shortly on a map here in the US, there are a few places that have tried to or have taxed ENDS almost as much as cigarettes, in particular, the state of Minnesota, and also in some recent federal proposals that we saw since the Biden administration has come in. So the issue here is, should ENDS be taxed? And if so, how much? And in particular for this talk, how much relative to tax rates on cigarettes? Now, to answer this question, of course, you have to recognize that there might be different motivations for taxing these products. And so what I am going to do in this talk is run through 5 of the main motivations for taxation and examine what each one would imply for cigarette and ENDS taxes. And the nice thing that falls out of the conclusion from each one of these is that you basically get the same conclusion. And that conclusion would be that regardless of which objective function you have, taxes on the e-cigarettes and other harm-reduced products would be relatively lower and likely relatively much lower than those on traditional cigarettes. So first, before I jump into the more formal analysis, just a bit more on background. So here in the United States, every single state taxes cigarettes. There is a federal excise tax of about $1 a pack that is placed on top of that. There is no federal tax on ENDS yet, although that has been proposed, was not adopted about a year, 18 months ago. Some states and localities do have taxes on ENDS, however. So here's just a quick picture from the Tax Foundation. You can see that many states, including some of the most populous ones, California and New York in particular, jump out on this graph, do tax vapor products. And in a few cases, these tax rates are very, very high. So in Minnesota, they're taxed at almost 100% of the wholesale price. In Washington, D.C., it's 80% of the wholesale price. These are tax levels that are approaching, or in the case of Minnesota, about equal to their cigarette tax. So just to set the stage, since each one of us here probably have different levels of knowledge about this topic, let me just set out 3, I'll just call them stylized facts about e-cigarettes. So the first is that although of course they are not risk-free products, they are almost surely from what we know so far, not nearly as harmful as traditional cigarettes. So just one of many sources I could cite, National Academy of Science from a couple of years ago, said that there is substantial evidence that vaping exposes users to far fewer toxic substances while using compared to smoking. They also found that switching to e-cigarettes from smoking results in improved short-term health outcomes in their review of the literature. Of course, the long-term health effects remain unknown because we don't have any long-term users yet, and because e-cigarettes are so new. And this is not their conclusion, but it's mine. It's hard to imagine that it could possibly be as dangerous as smoking, given what we know so far. But of course, research will continue to advance along that front. So the second stylized fact, or just plain old fact, is that ends can help some smokers quit. So there was an excellent pair of Cochrane reviews on this, just updated in 2021, looked at 61 RCTs and found that using ends to help quit smoking led to better success rates than NRT, counseling, or just cold turkey, pure willpower alone. The third fact is that economists have demonstrated fairly consistently, almost uniformly consistently, that ends in cigarettes are economic substitutes, not complements, at least at the market level. There's a long list of citations there. So what that means is that if you raise the price through taxes of e-cigarettes, then that's going to increase the demand for cigarettes. And so, for example, one of these papers found that if you taxed ends just as highly as you taxed cigarettes, then the number of people smoking in the US would increase by over 8%, and we would have almost 3 million smokers who would be deterred from quitting. So the implication here is that, as we will shortly see, the appropriate relative tax on ends being much lower could be part of a harm reduction strategy just from a pure public health point of view. So let's see. So there are many rationales, some proposed more familiar to economists, some more familiar to public health officials, and others as well. So the 5 that I'll talk about here, first is just the goal to raise revenue. So this would be a standard, we need the money argument. Second would be to correct for externalities or some sort of market failure. Third would be to improve public health. Fourth would be to take the behavioral economics approach that has become popular in recent years of correcting for so-called internalities, in other words, irrationality on the part of consumers. And then fifth, with a question mark, because it would be an odd reason to tax these products. But of course, in general, income redistribution is a notion that is important for taxation. So in case you want to tune out after this slide, I'll aid and abet that by giving you a graphical summary of the results here. So if you wanted to raise a given amount of tax revenue and do that causing consumers the least amount of harm in lost economic benefits from consumption, then the so-called Ramsay Rule says that the relative demand elasticities are what are important. And since demand for e-cigarettes is much more elastic than that for cigarettes, then that optimal rule would apply that you would tax ends less than cigarettes. The other two, or the next two rationales for externalities in public health, of course, depend much more on the relative health harms. And again, given that e-cigarettes are so much less risky, then you would tax them less compared to cigarettes. The fourth rationale, internalities, in addition to the actual relative health harms, also depends on the degree of misperception of these products by consumers. Well, the fact is that misperceptions regarding vaping are actually much worse than misperceptions regarding cigarettes, because most people know that cigarettes are quite risky products. And that, again, would reinforce the relative health harms result to lead to taxing e-cigarettes less. And then redistribution just doesn't really fit into this diagram well, because if you were interested in redistribution, you actually wouldn't tax either of these products. Okay, so with the time that I have remaining, let me just run through these rationales one at a time. And so the first one is a well-known problem in the economics of public finance, which says, given a certain amount of revenue that you want to raise, and so this revenue requirement is R with the bar over it in that equation down there on the very right-hand side. And given that you want to raise this revenue, let's do it in a way that diminishes total economic surplus as little as possible. An economist would say we want to minimize the deadweight loss from these commodity taxes. So we're going to pick taxes tau 1 through tau k for these capital K different goods to maximize total surplus subject to the revenue requirement. Okay, that's the equation over there, just that you're raising enough money that you want to. So this leads to the familiar Ramsay Rule from public finance. In the Ramsay Rule, it calls for goods with more elastic demand being taxed less. And under this simplest formulation of this problem, which would include no cross-price effects, in other words, that you have independent goods, and that there are no income effects, and also that you have competitive supply. These would be the simple assumptions. Then you get this beautifully simple rule down here at the bottom of the screen, that the optimal tax rates for each good are just inversely proportional to the demand elasticity. So just as a back of the envelope calculation, let's apply this simple rule. We'll extend it in a moment to what we know about demand elasticity for these products. So using the standard number of -0.4 for demand elasticity for cigarettes, and notice that that is inelastic demand because that number is less than 1 in magnitude. And there is greater variation in the literature on demand elasticity for e-cigarettes because these products are new. They're very varied. Demand can be different in different places, and methodology can differ. So there's actually a range of estimates that I've pulled from the literature, but they're all in the elastic demand. These are numbers greater than 1, so -2.3 to -1.3. So the Ramsay Rule applies that the relative taxes given by that equation there in the second bullet point would be in the range of 3.25 to 5.75. So just taking the midpoint for the sake of being succinct, that would imply, for example, that cigarette taxes should be around 4.5 times the tax rate on e-cigarettes. Now, those are relative tax rates. In the paper, I run through a quick calculation just to show that if you wanted to think in terms of unit taxes, you would also find that the unit tax would be much lower on ends than on cigarettes. So let's relax some assumptions because, of course, these are not independent goods and there may be income effects in demand. So working out the math for the expanded case leads to, unfortunately, a messier looking equation. So what you see here is just on the left-hand side, you have the relative tax rates. And then on the right-hand side, you have a ratio involving elasticities, cross-price elasticities, and the budget shares of these goods, as well as the term in parentheses has to do with the income effects. So just working through this briefly, you can see there the numbers that I took from a study by Chad Cotty and a large number of co-authors to plug into this equation. And once one does that, you find that cigarette taxes should still be taxed higher by this criterion than ends, except that the multiple has dropped from 1.75. Now, let me just mention, of all the results that you'll hear today, this is the one that I would say is the most tentative, just because this literature is evolving. And particularly the cross-price elasticities, we're still working in, well, mostly studies done by other folks estimating demand are still working to really nail those down. So there's probably the largest confidence interval, widest confidence interval around that slide. Okay, so moving along. The second rationale would be to correct for externalities. So this is a standard diagram that you're looking at here, as you might see in an intermediate level or even principles level microeconomics class, just saying, okay, it's supply and demand. But the problem with the demand curve is that my demand doesn't account for the negative externalities my secondhand smoke, for example, might be providing to others. So optimality in this setting just requires that the marginal social benefit be equated to the marginal social cost. And there is a theoretical tax that can do that. It's T star labeled there in the graph. But the point is that the height of the tax to correct for externalities for each good depends on how much external harm is being created. Okay, so the relative taxes will depend on the ratio of those marginal external harms. So for cigarettes, we know a lot about secondhand smoke and even so-called third-hand smoke. Secondhand smoke in the US has been estimated to lead to about 40,000 deaths per year, which is about 1.5% of all deaths. For ends, for e-cigarette products, of course, we're still learning about the effects of secondhand vapor, and there is some contention in the literature on this. But from my read of it, most studies find that the harmful substances in the secondhand vapor just have a small fraction of pollutants that are in cigarette smoke. And for example, other studies point out that, well, if you just wanted to use air quality standards as posted by WHO or the EU, then vaping within a closed small room actually would still meet those air quality standards. And again, it's all about the relative risk, and any exposure to others' secondhand vapor, if there are harms, they would likely to be much less than for smoke. One could also think about fiscal externalities, sometimes gets discussed in this literature. That's, I smoke for a lifetime and then I get sick in a costly way to the National Health Service plan. That would be a so-called fiscal externality. And again, those externalities would be smaller for e-cigarettes just because they are not as harmful. So you don't even really need to do any math here, just refer back to the relative harms, and you would conclude that the optimal taxes for the e-cigarettes would be much less than those for cigarettes. So the third rationale is to achieve public health gains. Now, the goal here is taken to be, let's try to improve public health as much as possible, given that we're creating no more than a certain amount of deadweight loss. Deadweight loss being economist jargon for lost economic benefits in the marketplace. Equivalently, you can think of this problem as trying to minimize deadweight loss given to a certain given increase in public health, which could be measured by, for example, quality adjusted life years or something like that. So before getting into the math, let me just jump right to the inside of what will fall out of the math. So with more elastic goods, in other words, goods with more elastic demand, it's very costly in terms of deadweight loss to improve health. When you raise their prices to try to discourage use because of the elastic demand, that creates a lot of deadweight loss. Also, with less harmful goods, raising the tax won't improve health very much. So those facts together are going to lead to the conclusion that you would, again, by this rationale, one would be led to tax e-cigarettes less than traditional cigarettes. So formulating this as a planning problem from the economic point of view would say, okay, we want to improve health by capital delta. It's just, that expression there is just saying we're going to impose a tax T on the producer price Q so that demand X falls by a certain amount. And so you can set up the constrained optimization problem here that involves the utility function of the indirect utility function of the representative consumer. And let's just jump to the first order condition that is necessary for an optimum here. So that equation in the box there looks kind of like the Ramsay rule that we saw before, except that the relative tax rates on the left side are now replaced by some other ratios. And these ratios are, just look at the numerator. So that's the marginal health harm divided by the price for good one, which is to say that that's the marginal health harm from $1 spent on the first good. So rearranging that optimality condition gives us the expression at the top of this slide. The right-hand side of that equation is the elasticity ratio, which we saw was 4.5 from the discussion of the Ramsay rule for rationale number 1. So what are the terms on the left? Okay, so the first term on the left is the ratio of the marginal harms from cigarette and ends use. Now, we don't know exactly what that is. So just to have a number to plug in to see what we get, we can take Public Health England's relatively famous statement or infamous statement, depending on your point of view, that smoking cigarettes is 20 times as harmful, at least, than smoking ends. So that first term there, let's just plug in a 20. Well, if you have 20 times something equals 4.5, then that's something, and that something is the price ratio, the second term over there, must be a lot less than 1. Okay, so that just means that you would have to have a price ratio and therefore a tax ratio that taxes ends much less than cigarettes. Now, again, we can make this formula more complicated, and I do that in the paper. You can allow for cross-price effects in demand, and that would basically just strengthen the conclusion. In this case, unlike the first case, cross-price effects actually imply that you would tax ends even less. So the fourth rationale would be to correct for internalities. Now, this might require a little more explanation. It might be a little less familiar than the standard argument about externalities. So an internality here is just a buzzword saying that there's something irrational about me as a consumer. So for example, perhaps I misperceive the risks. In other words, I think that a product is much safer than it actually is, or vice versa. Second, I might have so-called time inconsistent preferences. Okay, so this is just, my future self really hates it that my past self started smoking. So let's take these in turn. First, regarding misperceptions. So for smoking, at least here in the US, where this survey evidence pertains to, perceptions, I would say, are fairly accurate in the sense that most adults know that smoking is very harmful or extremely harmful. And only 1.4% thought smoking was not at all harmful. And you really have to wonder if those 1.4% of people were just randomly filling in bubbles in the survey. But perceptions of e-cigarettes are not at all accurate. So people greatly overestimate the risk. So in the PATH Wave 5 study, 2/3 of people think that e-cigarettes are just as harmful as cigarettes, almost surely false. More than 1/4 of them think that ends are more harmful, almost surely false. And fewer than 3% think that ends are actually the accurate case, much less harmful. So just note that if you wanted to take the behavioralist economic approach here, you would actually subsidize a product with these sort of misperceptions. I won't pursue that, but it is interesting to note. Okay, how about the time inconsistent preferences? So my present self might want to smoke, but my future self will wish that I hadn't started. So I'm sort of inconsistent between my two selves. So this is considered an intrapersonal market failure. It's a psychological or rationality failure, and that creates a so-called behavioral wedge between the true marginal cost of consumption and the true marginal benefits. And so this literature has worked out that an optimal corrective tax would be in the size of that wedge. So just briefly, the way we can model this using familiar notions of supply and demand is to think that I have two different demand curves. Okay, so the market demand curve is just the aggregation of all the so-called inattentive demand of the consumers. It involves the misperceptions and the underestimation of the harm, as I've drawn it here. And then the orange demand curve is the one with the accurate, fully internalized costs, the one that recognizes all of the health harms. So optimality just requires that we be at Q star instead of the larger quantity that we would see in the market. The problem is if people think that a product is less risky than it actually is, then there would be overconsumption of it. So that creates a behavioral wedge as marked there on the graph. And there is a tax in the height of that wedge that would lower demand down to the point where it would restore the optimal quantity. Well, but again, so this is just a graph for a single demand for a single product. But of course, this graph you would have one graph like this for cigarettes, one graph for e-cigarettes or other products. And the height of that wedge is clearly directly related to the misperceptions and the ignored health harm. But from what we've just seen, that comparison goes in the direction of either taxing ends less than cigarettes, or if you're only looking at misperceptions, perhaps even subsidizing them for smokers. Okay, finally and briefly, what about redistribution? Of course, we know that income taxes are often progressive in most places in the world, and there's a reason for that. It has to do with redistribution. Now, in general, you would never do commodity taxation for purposes of redistribution, because excise taxes, both in theory and in practice in the US, have been shown to be regressive and sometimes highly regressive. Well, what about for these goods in particular? Well, it's kind of a double whammy, because not only are commodity taxes in general regressive, but when you look at who uses these products, you see that it's more likely to be used by those with the least income. Now, everyone knows this for cigarettes. Sometimes people have the idea that only wealthy people smoke, or the lowest income people. Sorry. Sometimes people think that low income people don't use vaping products. That's actually not true here in the US. So the graph on the right is for vaping, and you can see the lower the income, for the most part, there is an income gradient here. It's not as steep as for cigarettes. Okay, so I have about 3 minutes left, and so we're on time here. So a final point that sometimes comes up in discussion, often prominently so, completely understandable, is, well, that's all well and good, you, Mr. Economist, throwing all this theory at us, but it's really all about the children. We have to tax these goods because we want to prevent youth vaping. Well, here's the thing, though. There's nothing in the analysis above that doesn't also apply to youth, except possibly some economists, and particularly those in public health, would say, oh, well, we don't want to include anything about dead weight loss or consumer benefits for children because they don't have well-formed preferences yet. They don't know what they're doing. They're getting addicted before they have a chance to make rational decisions. So even under that, we would say, well, still the health issues are the same, right? So this is all a statement about relative taxes, and cigarettes are still relatively much more harmful for youth. And so the same conclusions would apply. Other considerations, just briefly, when we're talking about e-cigarette taxes and youth smoking, is that we know, we are starting to learn more about this from good econometric literature in recent years, is that when you raise the prices of e-cigarettes through taxes, that spurs youth smoking. Because these goods are connected and they're substitutes, you cannot tax one in isolation without increasing usage of the other. I would also just mention very briefly that taxes are very blunt instruments to reduce youth vaping, because the tax just applies to everyone. And given that, given that the price elasticity is likely to be higher for younger people because they have lower income and are more price sensitive, this does kind of provide a more nuanced path where maybe you tax some to discourage youth vaping, and you wouldn't have to tax it necessarily all that much. And you would get the benefits of not discouraging too many adult smokers, although that remains to be worked out. Okay, so that's it. I do have a complete version of this paper. I'm actually still in the process of reviewing and revising this for a journal, so please go ahead and grab that QR code, take a look at it, and send me any comments that you have. They will be most welcome. So thank you very much. And I'll just leave this slide up, Patricia, so that they can grab that shot.
Thank you very much, Professor Prieger. Extremely informative. We still have not received any questions through the Q&A and chat box. So if you do have questions, this is the time to ask them. Appreciating that a lot of it is very technical, but I'm sure that Professor Mathios wants to kick us off with a few questions and a few comments as well. And then, of course, I'll be very happy to turn it over to Professor Kenkel. And if you don't mind, I have some questions of my own because I found this very fascinating.
So, Don, are you going first, or am I?
Yeah, actually, maybe I will. I had a really general comment. I mean, as Patricia just said, this is a, very, pretty technical thing. But I'm just very impressed with how much evidence and framework that Professor Prieger used, to bring economics. And it reminded me of something. So actually, the beauty of having two screens, I called up on my web a quote that might kind of embarrass Professor Prieger, from whom it comes, because I was reminded of what Gary Becker, one of my advisors, said when he won the Nobel Prize in economics. And he was actually going back talking about one of his PhD advisors, Milton Friedman, who also won the Nobel Prize. And his comment was that, my first encounter with Milton Friedman was when I took his course in microeconomics, and it renewed my excitement about economics. He emphasized that economic theory was not a game played by clever academicians, but was a powerful tool to analyze the real world. His course was filled with insights both into the structure of economic theory and its applications to practical and significant questions. And that's what I love about this presentation, that, we might have seemed, at times, lots of equations and things, but, we're really, it really provides a really nice framework to pull in all sorts of evidence base to address, this really important question about, how much should we be taxing e-cigarettes? So with that kind of, very big comment, one thing that Professor Prieger mentioned in the middle that I actually fairly early on was that one of the results was sort of the most questionable, because the research on the substitutability or the cross price elasticities, what happens when you tax e-cigarettes, what happens to the demand for cigarettes, is a rapidly growing area of research. And that's actually related to some research we've been doing. So I thought maybe, Alan, maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so Don and I have been, Professor Kenkel and I have been working on some research that has been funded by the Foundation for Smoke-Free World. And we've done discrete choice experiments, which are trying to get people's stated preferences for what they would choose across the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, Japan, Indonesia, China, and Sweden. So we tried to sort of do a broad global view, as much as, at least 7 countries. And the way we set this up was to use only adult smokers. So we don't have youth in our samples, but we gathered samples and posed a choice where we asked people whether they would choose a cigarette, choose an e-cigarette, or quit both cigarettes and e-cigarettes and quit smoking. And we presented them with a number of scenarios where we varied attributes based on sort of public policy actions that governments have been taking. So we varied flavor availability for e-cigarettes. We varied the nicotine content of e-cigarettes, and we also varied, for example, the type of warnings that governments are putting on e-cigarettes. But most importantly, for responding to this talk, we varied both the price of the cigarettes and the price of e-cigarettes. So what I thought I'd just do in response, given how relevant this is to this talk, just give you a sense of our results of what happens when people are presented with a higher price on e-cigarettes. How would they change their choices between choosing a cigarette, an e-cigarette and quitting? And what's remarkable when I'm and we're still in progress on some of this research, certainly. So we haven't published this work yet, but across all countries, when you raise the price of e-cigarettes, we see statistically significant movement towards more people choosing cigarettes when posed with this hypothetical choice. And these results, these are not small results. So we're seeing 1 to 2%, 3% in some cases, 6% in some cases, increase in the probability of using a cigarette with $1 increase. We converted all across the country to convert everything to US dollars. So an equivalent of $1 increase in the price of an e-cigarette, we see large and significant movements towards cigarettes. And what we were surprised at as well in our preliminary results is that we see very small movements to people choosing to quit both. So when you're raising the price of e-cigarette, you don't move people towards not using either, but you should, again, mostly move people away from e-cigarettes. In some sense, the own price elasticity is strong, and almost all the movement away from e-cigarettes goes to cigarettes. The largest impacts were in Indonesia and in China and in Japan. Somewhat smaller, but still significant and meaningful results in the US, Australia, UK, and Sweden. So it's so relevant to exactly trying to get parameters in your model that you've sort of presented, Professor Prieger.
Yeah, I look forward to converting those to elasticities and sticking them into the formula. Or hopefully
if
you've
we
already
actually
done
saw
that.
this before, we would have could have started putting these into elasticities. I mean, one of the challenges that we've done is because in these hypothetical structures, you can only pose so many different prices to them. So this is not market. So we use the last price paid for a cigarette in our cigarette price manipulations, but for e-cigarettes, we scoped out each country's sort of average price of an e-cigarette, and we halved it and we doubled it. So each individual is only seeing 3 different price scenarios when we ask them to make their decisions. So it's a little tricky. We need some assumptions if we're going to convert these to elasticities. We need to make assumptions about the shape of that demand, that cross price elasticity, because we only observe 3 different prices for each person in the scenarios.
Thank you, Professor Mathios. And we do have the first few questions for Professor Prieger, and I will read each of them and then allow you the opportunity to answer because they're very different. So the first question is, did you incorporate the assumptions about e-cigarettes impact or potential impact on smoking initiation? The fact that cigarettes, some say they may be a gateway to smoking.
And the brief answer is no. So I think the way to view this work is not necessarily as a final set of conclusions, like we've nailed everything down by modeling everything exactly the way we would want to, but more as a first attempt toward that. So in the formulas, and you'll see in the paper, I'm essentially treating these as any other consumption good, but for certain things like misperceptions or health harms or externalities or internalities. So your point is very well taken. A fuller analysis would include take things like the addictive nature, the cross initiation effects, could build those into the analysis. So the short answer is no, with the asterisk that your point is well taken and that is work that I would like to do. Thank
you. And the other question is, well, you mentioned that cigarettes and e-cigarettes are substitutes from an economic and point of view, of course. In some countries where there is a ban on public smoking, but vaping is not banned, there is a concern that there could be dual use. And if I can interject here, and I'm sure you probably, and I think the third question here is actually tied into this, whether your results are country specific or if they can be generalized for other countries. And before we move on, in terms of dual use, there is one thing that we need to notice is that, every individual needs a certain amount and rhythm, I guess, of delivery of nicotine during the day. So also to the point that you were making before about, if you make the price too convenient, it increases use of one particular product. I think with this kind of product, you cannot use it ad infinitum, right? It's just a need-based, if you wish, and preference-based. So the premise is that the preferences don't really change. You're not going to just use more nicotine because it's cheaper. You're going to use as much as you need. So again, just to recap, what happens with dual use? Do you account for that in countries where you can use both products? And also if the results are country specific. Okay, so to deal with this second one, yes, country specific,
almost of necessity because almost all of the econometric studies for e-cigarettes are done for the US market. Less so for the elasticities for cigarettes. But strictly speaking, you'll notice that all of my examples and all of my facts were specific to the US, and that's because this paper was originally written for that policy context. So important question, and there's your answer there. Yes, country specific, mainly to the US. I don't expect that it would be wildly different in most other developed countries, however, but that remains to be seen. Your other question about dual use, so you raise an important point there. A lot of times non-economists misunderstand what it means to have substitutes in demand. It does not mean that a person, any given nicotine user, would only use cigarettes or only use e-cigarettes. All it means is that on the margin, if I raise the price of one of them, that the marginal user will shift a little bit more towards the other good. And so it is entirely consistent that a person could be a dual user, but still have, as economists define it, a sense of substitution in demand for those two goods. Now, they might be complements for that person as well, given the incredible variety of human psychology and physiology and everything else. It would be shocking if we didn't find in any given place, if we knew perfectly, that for some people, they're complements and for others, they're substitutes. But what the econometric studies tell us is that overall at the market level, when you aggregate up all this behavior, they are shown fairly robustly to be substitutes.
I'll just add that.
Professor Mathios, would you like to add something?
So I'll just add, when I look at our results across these 7 countries, there is this remarkable consistency of this relationship between prices of e-cigarettes and showing that moves people to the substitute of cigarettes. So it seems, again, very consistent. It's rare, I think, to look at 7 different countries with very different cultural settings and attitudes towards products, and yet see this remarkably strong result in some ways, all statistically significant. And so I think while your work is country specific, our work suggests that it's probably not country specific, and this is a more general phenomenon.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think this also addresses one of the questions that we just got in, which were basically what would be the implications of, different types of taxation. For instance, for a country like Nigeria, one of our questions come from Nigeria, and I think you've just answered it, that in principle, it could be extrapolated. We do have another question which I'd like to raise, and of course, not only Professor Prieger, but I know all of you are very familiar with this area. Maybe you want to take a shot at answering. One of our participants from Malaysia, or speaking about Malaysia, mentioned that although e-cigarettes are taxed about 40% less than traditional combustible cigarettes, the retail price of the 2 types of products actually is close, so does not reflect the difference in the taxes imposed. And sadly, this may give the government reasons to increase, or not sadly, this may give the government reasons to increase the taxes on e-cigarettes further in the future. And any thoughts on this, and perhaps how to address it?
I was going to mention, brings in another really interesting phenomenon in these markets is, how the taxes are translated into prices. And, this is what public finance economists talk about, this rate of pass-through. And again, in the US markets, there's a lot of evidence, and now for traditional cigarettes, and now more recently for e-cigarettes, that taxes are pretty much passed through one for one into prices. So you impose $1 tax, you're likely to get at least $1. Sometimes some evidence seems to suggest a little bit more than $1 increase in the price. But that doesn't that might not carry over into all markets. Even on this side, the supply side of the market might be more different, I guess, than the demand side. So far, all the price elasticity stuff we've been talking about is how consumers respond. And I think we are starting to accumulate a lot of evidence that consumers respond in the same way. but how the markets respond depend on, how much competition there is in the market. And that might be explaining why those prices are as they are in Malaysia, where the prices of e-cigarettes don't seem to be related to the tax in the same way you might expect. But I'm not sure, exactly where we go with that, other than saying that, in this case, it'd be very important to do a country-specific analysis.
Yeah. It's actually, speaking of the country, Professor Kenkel and I are just embarking on extending our discrete choice experiments to Malaysia. So actually, we'd love, offsite. Our contact information is available. We're happy to chat as we develop this. And another comment with respect to the prices versus the taxes. So one of the things we're trying to explore in some of our work is we're manipulating prices in our discrete choice experiment. And so does the starting price, so when someone starts with a low particular price and we raise it, does that have the same impact for someone starting with a higher price and raising it proportionally? So we're trying to explore these more subtle aspects of how changes in prices influence both cigarette choice, e-cigarette choice, and quitting behavior.
And of course, another question would be whether the savings are passed on to consumers if taxes are reduced.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, if there would be an asymmetric response there. I will say, just to clarify something, so given absence of good information to the contrary, what is worked into the formulas that you saw presented was essentially 100% pass-through of tax to price. And that enters the model through just assuming that it's competitive with a flat marginal cost curve. In other words, that there are no economies or diseconomies of scale, which is almost certainly true at the scale that cigarettes are produced at, I would say, although there is clearly market power there. But as I believe Don mentioned, even with the market power, it does seem that, a company like PMI, Altria, they appear when the tax goes up by $1 to add $1 to the pack price. So I feel relatively comfortable with that 100% pass through. For cigarettes, for e-cigarettes, we don't know. We don't have enough experience yet, although you can't say it's a very competitive market, right? There's a multiplicity of products. It's a young market. It is rapidly evolving. But I think we'll learn some very interesting things as we see more of these taxes around the world about how these companies actually do respond to these taxes. And then, of course, we can refine our formulas. But it's hard to imagine that a certain amount of, if the pass-through is only 80% instead of 100% or something like that, I mean, that's not going to undo a multiple of 4.5, excuse me, that comes out of, the optimal relative tax rates.
I had another question for Professor Prieger, taking a little bit different direction and thinking about a different margin. I was wondering if you've thought about the implications about illegal markets and smuggling of relative for electronic cigarettes and cigarettes. I mean, I did some work a while back on how a state might try to set its tax on cigarettes, knowing that it's right next to a state that has a much lower tax. So like Washington, D.C. and Virginia, for example, Washington, D.C. set a very high rate of cigarette tax, but a lot of that was undone by the fact that people could just take the metro down to Virginia and buy cheap cigarettes. But I'm wondering if there's, again, I'm wondering about how this would all play out, relative rates of taxation of cigarettes versus e-cigarettes.
Right. Good question. So the illicit market notion is not really present in this particular paper. Just very briefly, I can mention I'm working on an empirical project instead of just a theoretical one, looking that's related to that issue right now. Have a paper that's kind of on the conference circuit now, just looking at the relationship between raising prices of legal cigarettes, how that can stimulate demand for illicit cigarettes. And I and others, you and others have demonstrated that in the past. But the new angle here is using cross-country, cross-time data, looking at whether the availability of e-cigarettes can provide a bit of a safety valve. In other words, we really have three substitute goods here. There's the e-cigarettes, the legal cigarettes, and the illegal cigarettes. If you make legal cigarettes more expensive, but ends are widely available, then maybe on the margin, there are some people that might have turned to black market cigarettes who instead would just turn to vaping and use a legal available product. And that phenomenon, as one would expect, does appear to be present in the data, although I'm still exploring that.
We don't seem to have any immediate questions from the audience. If I may follow up on the illegal market and size of the illegal market, I am aware that there is less of a, I guess there is less accurate data regarding the actual size of the illegal e-cigarette market. With respect to the US, it's interesting if that could be defined as products that haven't submitted in time their pre-market tobacco application or haven't received one. But the reality is there are no official statistics, and we have seen that the Food and Drug Administration is rather slow to enforce against those products. We're all aware they exist. We all see them, in various venues. So unlike conventional cigarettes, which they're not readily displayed necessarily at point of sale, if they're illicit, they're sold out of the proverbial white van. For vaping products, I think the marketplace today is slightly different. Because of perhaps lack of enforcement. Certainly the legitimate, or I should say the large chain retail chains carry products that either have filed their PMT or received a marketing order. But there is a proliferation of smaller shops and some online retailers that, it's really very difficult to quantify. So it would be helpful indeed if there was at least an understanding of the size of the issue, because there is a lot more data regarding the size of the cigarette black market as opposed to the e-cigarette black market, and that certainly could have an impact. And of course, the leverage there is price differential. I mean, the reason the black market exists, it's price differential primarily, but in terms of e-cigarettes, it's not really about price, it's about availability of products that haven't been taken off the market yet by the Food and Drug Administration.
So I'll just add, so we submitted, Professor Kenkel and I submitted comments to the Food and Drug Administration, so it's publicly available through that mechanism, where we examined the menthol, the proposed ban of menthol cigarettes, and we also manipulated what if the FDA prohibited menthol in e-cigarettes, and how that would move people. And what we found there is in preliminary results that would move more people to the illegal cigarette market if you in fact also made menthol and e-cigarettes illegal. Now, these are stated preference. Again, we don't use market data. We use these hypothetical stated preference models. But it was a interesting result that we thought was worthy. So we highlighted that result in our comment to the FDA, that whatever they do on menthol, on flavors for cigarettes, whatever results there are, they have to be very careful about how they also think about the interrelationship between legality on both e-cigarettes and cigarettes.
Okay. We're coming to the end of our webinar, just mindful of the time. Professor Prieger, will there be a follow-up to this study? What are the immediate priorities in a minute or so?
Well, let's see how this study is received first, and hopefully folks present today can send me some good comments, and there's already been some good comments on extensions. So yes, there is potentially much more work to be done here. 5 seconds just to say, even though I play one on TV, I'm not really a theorist. So I much more enjoy doing work with data. And so I probably, extensions to this work, I would like to bring some econometrics and some actual data to continue the conversation here.
We really appreciate it. I wish to take this opportunity to remind you all that there will be replays of this webinar through the foundation website. And of course, you can reach out to the distinguished professors with questions. Thank you very much again, Professor Kenkel, Professor Prieger, and Professor Mathios. And we are most grateful to all of you who joined us today. We are looking forward to seeing you at future webinars organized by the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. Have a wonderful day or evening, wherever you are, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.